Welcome to My Steel Commodity Flux, the podcast where we track the trends, turns, and turbulence shaping global commodity markets. Today, we focus on China's petcoke market and, more specifically, how changes in policy priorities, industrial structure, and downstream demand are starting to reshape both domestic market logic and global trade positioning. Joining us today is Liao Na, Chief Consultant of Energy Policies.
Thank you. It's good to join the conversation.
Before turning to petcoke itself, it is useful to begin with the broader backdrop. In many commodity discussions, China is still assessed through a fairly traditional framework: growth, construction, and industrial demand. But that framework appears to be becoming less sufficient. What is changing at the macro level?
The key change is that China is moving away from the old growth model. The traditional model, built around property, infrastructure, and scale expansion, is encountering increasing constraints. At the same time, the policy direction is moving toward what can be described as Growth 2.0, a model centered more on security, industrial upgrading, advanced manufacturing, and domestic resilience. That shift matters for commodities because it changes which sectors are supported, which sectors face constraints, and where future demand growth is likely to come from.
So, this is not only a macro story, it also changes how specific commodity value chains need to be understood.
Exactly. One of the key concepts here is the security filter. In the past, capital and capacity were often enough to justify expansion. Now, projects increasingly need to pass broader tests, including supply chain security, technology security, energy security, and carbon related constraints. That means the market environment is no longer shaped only by cost and scale. Policy compatibility is becoming much more important.
And this has direct implications for petcoke demand.
Yes, because once the policy framework changes, the downstream demand structure also changes. The sectors that used to anchor petcoke consumption are no longer the only reference point. The direction of industrial transition matters more than before.
Let's move to petcoke directly. What is the most important shift in China's petcoke market today?
The most important shift is that petcoke is no longer defined only by its traditional role as an industrial fuel. Under China's current policy and industrial transition, its market identity is becoming more differentiated. Historically, petcoke was widely used as a low cost fuel in sectors such as glass and cement, but under carbon constraints, that part of demand is coming under pressure. At the same time, the growth of new energy industries is creating a new demand center through battery anodes and advanced carbon materials.
So the issue is not simply total demand, but the composition of demand.
That's right. In the traditional market, fuel grade demand was the core of the market. Now, an increasing share of market attention is shifting toward higher value downstream applications. This can be understood as an identity shift. Petcoke moving from a basic energy fuel toward a strategic material feedstock. That is a structural change in how the market should be read.
And the transition is already visible in the numbers?
Yes, fuel grade consumption is shrinking, while petcoke use in battery anodes is rising quickly. By 2030, anode materials are expected to account for a much larger share of total petcoke consumption than they do today. So the market is not simply shifting in volume terms, it is undergoing value reconstruction.
That brings us naturally to anode materials. Why has this segment become so important in the petcoke market?
Because this is now the clearest area of structural demand growth. Anode material consumption increased from roughly 500,000 tons in 2021 to 2.7 million tons in 2025, representing an increase of approximately 440%. It is projected to approach 7 million tons by 2030, implying further growth of around 159% from 2025 levels. That makes anodes the main growth engine within the petcoke demand structure.
And there is also a change within the downstream mix itself.
Correct. EV batteries remain the dominant segment, but energy storage is becoming a more important second growth curve. Energy storage batteries increase their share from 10% to 25%, which shows that demand growth is becoming more diversified rather than concentrated in only one application.
So, from a market perspective, anodes change both the scale and the structure of demand.
Exactly. And they also change the quality requirements. This is important because once the downstream market shifts toward battery materials, not all petcoke grades benefit equally. That is where the supply side and trade implications begin to emerge.
Let's stay with that point. When downstream demand moves toward anodes, what changes in practical market terms?
The main change is that technical standards become much more important. Synthetic graphite now accounts for 88% of the anode market. As a result, standard metrics are no longer sufficient. Downstream users place much greater emphasis on indicators such as trace elements, sulfur content, and true density because these directly affect battery performance. In other words, the market is becoming more selective.
So the growth story is not a broad-based uplift across all grades.
No, it is more differentiated than that. There is a clear distinction between two downstream demand segments. EV and consumer batteries require high energy density and therefore favor premium low sulfur petcoke and needle coke. Energy storage prioritizes cost more heavily and therefore allows broader feedstock flexibility, including standard petcoke and pitch coke. That segmentation is important for understanding which materials are gaining strategic value.
Once demand becomes more differentiated and more quality sensitive, the supply question becomes more important. Can China's domestic supply keep pace with this shift in demand structure?
The answer is no. The key point is that downstream capacity expansion is moving much faster than China's domestic upstream supply growth. Downstream sectors are adding nearly 9 million tons of new capacity, while domestic delayed coking can effectively add less than 3 million tons. So the problem is not just demand growth by itself, it is the mismatch between demand expansion and supply elasticity.
So imports become necessary not just for balance, but for structural reasons.
Exactly. Imports become an absolute necessity under this framework. It also points out that domestic refinery margins are under pressure as new energy gradually displaces traditional fuel demand, which in turn limits delayed coking utilization. The result is that China's domestic production growth remains constrained while the deficit persists.
And the deficit itself is sizable.
Yes, the deficit is estimated at 17.2 million tons in 2026, widening to nearly 17.8 million tons by 2030. More importantly, this gap is driven by high quality anode and premium carbon demand, not by low value fuel demand. That distinction is key to understanding the trade implications.
That leads directly to the trade implications. If the deficit is increasingly tied to premium demand, how is China's import structure changing?
China's import structure is shifting from quantity to quality. Historically, high sulfur coke accounted for more than 70% of imports. But in 2025, low sulfur pet coke imports surged nearly 40% year on year, reaching 188,000 tons and making up 12% of total pet coke imports. At the same time, sourcing has been diversifying geographically toward origins such as Brazil, Argentina, and Oman, which are better positioned to provide spec grade materials, meaning materials that meet the technical requirements of the anode industry, including sulfur content, trace elements, and true density.
So, import demand is no longer centered mainly on volume, but increasingly on quality and downstream compatibility.
That is correct. The market is becoming more selective, and that changes both sourcing logic and supplier positioning. China is no longer simply a destination for low value fuel disposal, it is increasingly a premium buyer of higher quality feedstock globally.
Once import structure changes, pricing logic also changes. How is that reflected in the market?
The distinction between high sulfur fuel grade coke and low sulfur spec grade coke is becoming more consequential. Under dual carbon constraints, high sulfur fuel grade coke faces shrinking market share, while spec grade and low sulfur coke gain importance. In that framework, the ability to secure and deliver battery grade material increasingly determines pricing power.
So, quality differentiation is becoming a pricing driver, not just a technical detail.
Exactly. And that is why the market needs to be read through both downstream application and product compatibility. The widening spread between high sulfur and low sulfur grades is not just a price issue, it reflects a deeper restructuring of end use demand.
Given all of this, what are the main indicators that market participants should monitor?
There are four areas worth watching. First, the structural capacity mismatch, because that underpins the long term supply deficit. Second, Q2 refinery maintenance windows, which reduce domestic supply and can create import arbitrage opportunities. Third, technical alignment, especially trace elements and true density, because these determine whether material can meet high end downstream specifications. Fourth, the widening price spread between high and low sulfur grades, which increasingly affects trading margins.
And policy still sits above all of this?
Yes, that remains a key point. Policies such as tariffs, carbon caps, and energy efficiency mandates may not target petcoke directly, but they influence the market from both ends by raising upstream costs and constraining downstream emissions. In that sense, policy remains a key framework for decoding the market.
So the takeaway is that China's petcoke market is no longer a straightforward fuel story. It is increasingly shaped by industrial upgrading, downstream differentiation, tighter quality requirements, and a more selective import structure. That also means global suppliers and traders need to reassess where future value is likely to concentrate. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I hope this discussion has helped highlight the business opportunities arising in this transitional period.
And thank you for listening to Commodity Flux. Subscribe for more insights on the structural shifts shaping global commodity markets. We look forward to having you with us again.